Right, good evening, everyone. We've got three fairly substantive topics to get through today, so I will skip any preamble and just jump straight into things. I think the first thing to mention, though, is to welcome our young inspector, Taki Hussein, who's here today. And one young inspector has been attached to each scrutiny panel for a trial period of a year to enhance the council's scrutiny function for the engagement of young people in the scrutiny process. And so these young inspectors are young people with lived experiences of services who are trained and supported, excuse me for that, who are trained and supported by their participation and engagement team to further listen to and engage young people in services and be the voice of young people. So no pressure on that. So jumping straight in, are there any apologies for absence? None have been received. Fantastic. Are there any declarations of interest? None. Perfect. And the minutes of the previous meeting, are these a true and accurate record of the previous meeting? Yeah, agreed? Right, fantastic. So now moving on to the actions log. Are there any questions that people would like to raise about the actions log? No? All right, fantastic. So in previous times, we've always had it where performance monitoring has come at the end and a bit of a mad scramble where we haven't quite had a chance to give it the time that it deserves. And so before I pass over to officers, I'd like to invite Councillor Aidan Mundy to give an update to us all on some of the work in planning.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you, committee, for having me this evening. So in January, I came to you to inform everyone that through a quality assurance check, the development control team identified an underreporting of our performance. And that affected the period between May and November. And previously, earlier on today, I emailed you an update in writing, including all the updated statistics, but I'll just briefly run through the situation, what was identified, and take any questions you have before we obviously go on to the recommendations made in that paper. So essentially, the analysis identified there was a gap between what was reported and what actual performance was. So we were doing ourselves a disservice, and actually our performance is on an upward trajectory. So it is much better than was reported. And you'll see that in table 1 in the report. And our findings of this were due to basically three primary issues due to the software system used to capture this data. So it is about recording, it's about the tracking, and then the subsequent reporting of that. There comes and then some examples include so for May 2022 major applications, we reported performance at 66% when it was actually 80. October 2022 minor applications reported originally 32% when it was actually 85. And November 22 minor applications from 44 to 76. So you can see there is discrepancies there, and we were doing a hell of a lot better than reported. But what do we do next steps? Where do we go from here? So we've already taken steps internally to rectify this and put in measures, but the reality is the system is at the end of its life cycle. It's further complicated by the levelling up of regeneration bill, which puts or will put, when it receives its royal assent, a duty on local authorities to adopt a standardised way of recording their development control applications. This means that it is probably not the most efficient use of funds to procure a replacement system at this time, but instead to seek to maximise the current system, particularly on any migration to any new system. This would mean improving the data quality anyway and taking various steps. So what the paper recommends is that you will support a recommendation to develop an in-house task force to look at what changes can be made within the existing system to improve the data quality particularly, and then prepare for when the bill receives the assent for us to then replace the system with one which is going to be legally compliant as set out by the Secretary of State. We don't have further details on what that compliance will be, but I can, speculate that clearly it is there to make sure there is a coherent standard across the country when it comes to managing both the applications and data in software form, and reducing what we call vendor lock-in. So if you buy one software, then you're pretty much stuck with them for a long term. So these are the challenges and opportunities that we've outlined today, and happy to take any further questions.
Great, thank you very much. Are there any questions, Dan?
Thank you. So you've identified problems in the software. In terms of next steps, one of the main issues of complaint that we receive from the public is lack of ability to see comments that people put in on applications, and also councillors. That's never actually been implemented, where even councillors should be able to see what comments have been received, total number of objections and things like that. We've been promised that for years. So is that something that you can put on your action plan as part of this upgrade?
Yeah, so I mean, as part of any scope and exercise, there will be user engagement, and users obviously include us all here today. I do want to say that members of the planning committee do and can see all those written responses, but we won't. It'll take a while to go through the historic reasons why, and there are members on the panel here who can probably speak better to those decisions than I can. But what I will say is, as I said, there will be a process where we look for user engagement, both for those who are officers, but also those who enter in the information, because I don't know if many people here have actually gone through the planning application process as a customer. There is a lot of forms to fill in, and it's how do we make sure that we are supporting those to make applications in the most simplest way possible, and because you can miss something quite easily by the very nature that as people who would go through it once or twice in their lifetime, getting a loft conversion or getting a conservatory or something like that, we're not the typical user who's a large developer who would have that large apparatus behind them, who are typically able to bring off applications very quickly. So I think clearly we can need to do a lot more user engagement to make sure we get the system which is right for everyone.
Great, thank you. Anthony.
Thank you, Chair. I just confirm we're talking about the paper that was circulated to us this afternoon. Is that what we're talking about now, rather than the statistics that we're?
Yes.
So we're taking this agenda item now rather than later. Fine.
Yeah.
I just wanted to confirm, really, with the chair of the Planning Application Committee, that the task group that you're talking about would actually be looking at the software that manages the sort of back end of the sort of development control stuff, rather than the Planning Explorer end, which is what Councillor Holden was talking about. Or is it both, or is it everything? What is it exactly that they'll be looking at?
I think it's a very fair question. I think at this stage what we're talking about is primarily that back end. However, when you talk about procuring software systems in the interdependencies that they have with secondary systems such as the front end, we need to make sure that there is synergy, and make sure there's no challenges with integration. And I suspect will probably happen in the Levelling Up Bill and the guidance subsequent to that they will have front end implementation issues as a result of what the guidance will come through. So ultimately, it will be trying to procure a way forward which works both front end user experience and the back end.
Great, thank you. I don't think too long this. So two last questions to Dan, and then I'll go to Steve.
One of the other issues with the software and planning is turnover of case officers and things dropping through the cracks, and sometimes things like tree applications. The other year there was a 9-month delay and nobody realised until more councillors kept pestering. So how does the new system make sure we will not have that gap, and also how will it alert the actual applicants to when things are going to be decided?
Yeah, sure. I think so. I think there are two issues here. So one is obviously a new system, which we don't know what will be procured yet. And then the first is primarily about quality of data and quality assurance checks and all the good stuff that we can do now. And as you say, there's a combination of ward member lobbying and prompting. But as you can see here, this was proactively done from within the department to check our data. And as many people on the planning committee here who are also here know, we do a lot now quality assurance checks, whether it's viability assessments or whether it's our own data. So on the situation of that particular example you raise, it is about getting the data to a situation that we can run reports to pull out those cases which are extended beyond normal period, and this is often challenged sometimes in some of the legacy systems we have.
Great, thank you. And then the last question to Stephen.
Thank you, Chair. I have one comment really, which is that which I've already mentioned to my esteemed colleague, which is if I'd had a couple of pints, I'm not sure I could read subject to available resource and increasing returns to scale, implement, improve opportunities identified that support migration to a new system. And I think perhaps the odd comma or whatever might be helpful if that's what we're going to be recommending to the Cabinet. So I'll leave that to you to suggest what you might want to do there.
I think I 100% take ownership of any grammar issues or spelling issues in that paper, and it shows the importance of officers and their guidance when putting stuff together.
Thank you. The slightly more pithy question is that we're being asked to recommend to Cabinet that they plan to resource a programme of work and purchase through capital funds a replacement development control software system, but without any indication of what this might cost. I'm not sure how comfortable all of us should feel about recommending to Cabinet that they should spend money with no idea how much it's going to cost. Now, I do appreciate, because I have already raised it with my esteemed colleague, that we don't know. I'm not sure we don't know is sufficient for us to be recommending something. It is like saying you should have an open check here of an unlimited amount.
No, thank you. Definitely come back on that. I think ultimately we need to look at when we purchase systems and processes, the reality is, are they a regulatory requirement or are they nice to have? We are moving to a world now where there's a regulatory requirement to purchase a particular system, and we don't know yet what the ultimate price of those systems will be because those systems are not available yet to us. So what the paper asks is it effectively puts a duty on us internally to work together and to prime the availability of resources for the situation that we will need to upgrade our systems because we have that legal requirement to do so. Unfortunately, it is not a nice to have, it is a must and will be a must unless I doubt it will change, but unless those particular clauses are pulled from that bill, which I suspect won't happen.
In that case, Chair, might we include something to say that we'll have an opportunity to scrutinise it when the actual figure comes up or when it's clearer what our obligations will be?
Yeah, well, so I think my personal feelings, I don't think anyone here would disagree on, there's an officer task force to look at this to make sure this doesn't happen again. And so my feelings would be that, I'd assume that should just happen. And that, we don't think necessarily at this stage make a formal recommendation that this goes away and something happens with it. And then we can come back to this later once we've had a chance to look at the task force and see task force results and see what comes up. So would that be okay? Would that be okay, Councillor?
Yeah, so sorry, if you said, so this is recommended and we come back to you at a later date with some information before.
Well, I don't think we need to necessarily make a formal recommendation at this point. So I appreciate the caveats. And so I think just having this task force go ahead as, an eminently sensible suggestion, and then having something coming back from that, and then we can scrutinise once those results are in. So not having a formal recommendation at this point, but that's something that'll come back later on. But Anthony, I'm happy to hear your.
Thank you. Sorry, Chair. Just to throw a third option into the mix might be if the need to replace the software is a regulatory requirement, they don't need a recommendation from us. To that end, we could simply recommend B1, and we can make that recommendation, which is set up the task group, which might be what Aidan needs to establish that task group. B2 will happen anyway, in which case we don't need to make the recommendation, which gets over Stephen's concerns about it, on the understanding perhaps that the task group comes back to scrutiny.
Does that work for you, Aidan?
Indeed, thank you.
Yeah, so that'd be recommending the first part of the recommendations. So point one and go from that. So is everyone happy for that as agreed? We need a vote. Yeah, fantastic. Okay, is that the case, Stella? Fantastic. Okay, great.
Thank you.
No, thanks so much, Aidan. Brilliant. So with that, then we'll move on to the first item on homelessness prevention. So sorry. Oh, sorry. No, you're right as well. But also, Taki has a question.
I just wanted to ask, how long would it take to find out how much it would cost?
The question. So again, ultimately, so there are three factors here. One is we'll talk about cost as well. One is the time it takes for the bill to receive royal assent. Two is the time for the department to issue guidance. And then three is the time it takes vendors to produce software that is compliant. So those are the three caveats there. But ultimately, what now you all here have agreed is, we don't need to wait for that. Let's get some basic work done, because when you do software migrations, the fundamental key thing is high data quality. So that we can start that work now and get people together internally as a rallying with your support. It's a rallying call for everyone to put this up the internal agendas and have a bit more of a focus.
Thanks so much.
I just wanted to say thank you.
And yes, as my very helpful vice chair has just reminded me, my eagerness to move things along, I forgot to skip over or invite officers to comment generally on anything in the performance monitoring. So John or Paul, would you like to say anything about some of the statistics before us?
Thank you very much, Chair. Just a few in my area just to draw your attention to. The first one being CRP 124. That is the street reports rectified within the contract period. That was, I believe, in October 22 was a woeful 38.2%. That now has improved to 65.5%. Looking forward into some of my information that I have on January's performance, that's increased again to 82%. So it's moving in the right direction, which is positive. CRP 126, number of refuse collections, missed bins per 100,000. Current performance in December was 52.5. In December of 21, it was 120. So that service has dramatically improved. And once again, looking forward in my January data, that has improved yet again to 45 missed bins per 100,000. So the lower the number, the better. So we're moving in the right direction and with that metric. And then within the parks, the Tree Works Commission, that's SP 559, the percentage of tree works completed within the SLA. This is a good tracker for our new arboricultural service contract that has been mobilized and bedded in well, as we are exceeding the target performance in respect to that. I'd be happy to take any questions from members. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And Paul, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. There was a lot of discussion about the development control reporting there, so I don't need to repeat that here, but to draw attention to a couple of positive remarks. The income from development control, that's going up in the last quarter. So that's getting close to the target. And I think last month we discussed this and we said there was a lot of major planning applications coming in. They've got plan performance agreements attached to them. They're now in as well. So we thought by year end we catch up, and it looks like that's going well. So that's now green. With the enforcement cases in the backlog, again, I think you get the December performance here, but we've just had our departmental quarterly catch up last week, so it didn't match the timing of this. We've got new resource in the team as well. There's been new starters, so we're beginning to see improvement in the enforcement area as well. The current backlog is actually at 319. I think the reports in the paper here from last quarter was about 500. So there's been a good performance there, and it's getting close to what we consider normal casework, because you never get to zero anyway. So what comes in and what goes out, that's roughly where it's benchmarked with other authorities. And for the next meeting of this panel, there is a report on planning enforcement anyway, so we can delve into more of that in the next meeting. With the future Merton ones, they're annual measures, so we hope to conclude them next quarter, by the end of the year. But again, members in this group are on the EV charging task group, and we'll know that the electric vehicle charging availability is much higher than what the target was at 250. We're well above that already. The housing targets, we're still crunching through those numbers. That's slightly in the back burner because we did local plan inquiries last year, so we're catching up on that reporting. And again, with the highways, we've just had the surveys done, so probably the next meeting we'll report on the annual highway conditions. We know it's within target, but we have had a rough winter with lots of gritting and cold snaps. That does have an impact on the quality of the highway, but we're still just in target.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Any questions? I know you had one, Dan.
One for John on CRP 097 recycling. I see the targets have been missed again. Is there a particular reason why this particular month we haven't met target?
Thank you very much, Jeff. In terms of the target itself, once again, the 50% is a stretch target. We're aiming to reach the 45%. Long-term trend is a positive trend. We still remain top 7 in London in terms of our overall recycling rate. So buoyantly healthy in terms of performance, but we have stretch targets within it. At this stage, unless we put new services within that to extract more recycling, it will be incremental in terms of its increases because it is quite a large percentage already. But we will always endeavor to do better. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions, Stephen?
Thank you, Chair. When I joined the council last May and started seeing these statistics, I hadn't got a clue what they were going on about. And I do sometimes still feel a bit like that. And therefore, I've got a lot of sympathy for a new member of this group who's an inspector. But this was also triggered by the questionnaire, which I've just filled out. I don't know how many colleagues have been filling out the same questionnaire on our scrutiny process. But it did occur to me that, for example, for each meeting, if the officers were to highlight perhaps with a green tint and a red tint in each category statistics which were particularly of interest, then it might be a way of concentrating on what's really happening that's different in each meeting, rather than trying to rapidly scan down while the officers who know exactly what they're looking at are narrowing in on something that I've only just got to by the time they've finished saying what they're saying. I'm obviously being slightly facetious, but I think there's a lot of numbers here and a lot of information. If we could find a way of making it easier for us to concentrate on what's important, I think that will be good.
Just to come in that, so I completely agree with you, and I have started that conversation and had a chat with a couple of members on this panel about how to make that information more presentable and understandable for the lay person in this room. So those conversations are ongoing. I know the process has now started to evaluate how we collect those figures and present them. So I think we'll be seeing something over the next couple of months, and I'd be very happy to hear any specific thoughts you have on, like I say, on green tints and things like that that could help improve that. So please do just drop me a line on any of that stuff, and we'll incorporate that in. Any final questions, Dan?
Something a bit different. Parking SP 513 percentage of cases heard. That number seems to be getting worse. Is there a particular reason why that was getting worse when previously we were always told that we used to always win our cases?
I'll be able to pick this up. I'll have to speak to the parking team and the assistant director, but we can provide you a written response in respect to that. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Well, I might then move us on to the next item. So before that, but let's thank Aidan very much for coming and speaking to us. It's much appreciated. So yeah, if we now move on to invite Elliot Brunton to speak, and just before you get into your part, it'd be great to hear, because I know we shifted what we're going to discuss at this meeting. So maybe you can just give us just a quick overview, because we were going to discuss around support for renters, and to maybe just give quickly just why we had to change that to this item, and if 5 minutes or so worked, and then we can invite some questions from everyone else. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, there was originally a paper on housing enforcement in particular coming across. There still will be a paper coming soon. There's an awful lot going on in the housing enforcement world at the moment. So there's been a big review of how we carry out those processes across the country, frankly. And the Secretary of State had asked for a number of statistics that had to be sent across by the 27th of January. So we're just looking at the information that we've got at the moment and a number of different actions that the council's carried out to tackle damp and mould across both the private sector and registered social landlords. So there will be a paper coming shortly on that, but for today we've got a separate one on homelessness prevention. Okay, the paper focuses really, to start off with, on homelessness legislation. It's been around for a very long time. However, there was a significant change in 2017 with the Homelessness Reduction Act. If you look through the paper, you might be forgiven to think this is all rather complicated. It is. It's very complex stuff for the legislation, how the interactions between the various different duties. The paper itself mainly focuses on what's called homelessness prevention and homelessness relief. Those are the positive outcomes for when someone comes to the council with a housing problem, which means that they don't go into temporary accommodation. The paper sets out some of the steps that we're likely to take. One size most definitely doesn't fit all here. Essentially, you're either attempting to keep people where they are, assuming that's suitable, or failing that, finding them something suitable elsewhere. As I said, there's a number of different ways that we can do that. Some of it is cost neutral in terms of its advice and assistance, but a lot of it is based on market factors such as supply of private sector accommodation, which is probably the biggest one. But also Merton's quite lucky to have a reasonable supply of supported housing for single people locally, notably the Wimbledon YMCA and some other hostels. At the end of that section in 3.5, it sets out the yearly prevention figures and the year to date for 2022 and 2023. That is slightly down this year. I would say that was mainly due to a reduction in private sector supply. By the end of the year, I think it will probably be near enough what the year before, as there's been a slight recovery in January and February, but it's very difficult to say at the moment. However, those figures do directly tap into the council's performance in temporary accommodation, which I'll come on to in just a sec. There is a brief section on rough sleeping services. That's an area that exists slightly outside of the legislation, or rather it interacts with it to some degree, but particularly over the pandemic period, there was a big drive to take in cases that the council did not have statutory duties to do. And that, again, that happened across the country. So a lot of those cases we would never previously would have housed, we are now housing when they're identified rough sleepers. And certainly Angie Chu and her team do an awful lot of work to be responsive to reports of rough sleepers when they occur. Lastly, we've got information on temporary accommodation. I'm sure members have heard it before, but Merton does have the lowest number in temporary accommodation of any London borough. Having said that, there are challenges this year. There's been a significant increase. That was notably from sort of October to November. We do know that certainly across England, there's a 174% increase in possession orders in the private sector, and an 89% increase in bailiffs warrants. And this implies what we're seeing here. A lot of that is probably due to the moratorium and evictions that occurred during the pandemic. Some of you will know that actually ended in May 2021, but we haven't really seen the impact until later 2022. So far, it has been quieter in the new year, but it really is early days to say on that. We do know across London, there's been significant increases in homeless applications and people going into temporary accommodation. But if there's any specific questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
Thanks so much. I just want to, Andrew, thanks so much for joining us. Is there anything you want to add on to that?
Of prevention, and it clearly is very good in terms of temporary housing, and I'm very glad that we've been able to add to that accommodation for homeless clients. So we can see at 4.3, I think we're as of November we were housing 80 people either in nightly paid temporary accommodation, private rented shared housing or supported housing. I think this is very positive.
Thank you very much. So any questions about Martin?
Can I obviously welcome this report? Obviously, the rise in temporary accommodation is something I think that should concern us all. It's a huge issue across London. We know there's over 60,000 in temporary accommodation. What I'd be interested to know is obviously how does our increase compare to neighbouring boroughs? It would obviously be quite helpful to see that statistical information or pointers towards where you can access that, because I think I understand in some boroughs the increase has even been more. And also in terms of temporary accommodation, how many are currently obviously placed in Merson or neighbouring boroughs, and how many out of London placements do you currently have in terms of TA? And my final question in relation to this report is where do you envisage this going in terms of the actual trend? I think it would be useful obviously if we had this in terms of performance information coming to us, because I think it's something we should monitor very closely, especially as temporary housing comes out of the revenue budget. And I have got one final question, is obviously in terms of procurement of accommodation. Obviously we have a London-wide arrangement we signed up to. How is that actually working in terms of procurement?
Did you get all that, Elliot?
I'll try my best with that. Okay. First of all, the other London boroughs, that most of the statistics are published through something called HClick, which is about 6 months behind, where we're expecting to see the September figures shortly. However, I do have the June figures for some surrounding boroughs here. So bear in mind in June, Merton had, bear with me a sec. Right, I'll come back to Merton's figures just a second. It's 333 at the moment, but in June, Sutton had 846 cases. Croydon had 1,951 cases in temporary accommodation. Wandsworth had 2,985 cases in temporary accommodation. Richmond was a bit closer then at 349. And lastly, Bromley, because they're a non-stock owning authority, we often look at them, they have 1,598 cases. So there is quite a considerable difference. I also know, because it was in the press this week, that one borough in East London, which probably isn't that comparable to the borough, but it had 500 applications in the last month alone. That doesn't necessarily mean that all of those people have gone into temporary accommodation, but that would represent a huge amount coming through. In terms of the split of temporary accommodation by area, bear with me a sec. So currently there are 100 cases in borough. Out of the borough, the 224 cases, of which 220 are in London and only 4 are outside of London. I can tell you those ones outside of London are not a long way out of London. I think there's one in Gravesend and a couple in Surrey. There's no one placed further afield than that. And just on that point, the council has a legal duty to place people in borough so far as reasonably practicable, which means that the first point is you put them as close as you can and then you work out from there. So that's always the case with the council. In terms of the trend, it is difficult to say that there has been that big upsurge in November, and it's unclear at this stage whether that's going to be sustained at that level. I would say the trend will be upwards, but whether or not it's as steep as up as we saw on that 1 month remains to be seen. And a lot of the factors, cost of living is yet to be factored in as a possible cause of homelessness. What we definitely haven't seen yet is the potential for an increase in applications from people leaving the Homes for Ukraine scheme. We have seen some cases, but again, it's difficult to predict whether that particular group is going to be applying to the council in great numbers, but there's potential there as well. Did I pick up every point there, or if I missed one? Right, thank you. Merton is part of something called Capital Letters. That's a London-wide, or mostly London-wide agency that finds private sector accommodation on behalf of its member authorities. So something on the lines of about 18 of the authorities, it's probably higher now, are members of Capital Letters. They have been affected by economic factors, which has meant that there's been a drop in private sector accommodation right across London. Certainly there is, they've been looking at the incentives that are offered to landlords to try and increase supply of accommodation. So there has been agreement to increase that, but it's difficult. Landlords, frankly, can go elsewhere and get more money, and that makes it very difficult. I'll give you an example. In the borough, I think someone sent me three-bed properties in the Malden area the other day. One of those was £2,600 a month, one was 2,100, and one was 2,200. The local housing allowance that sets the height or the maximum amount that can be paid was 1,600. So that means that unless you're able to incentivize the landlord to reduce the rent, that means our customers have to meet their other benefits. And when that's anything between 400 to sort of £900 a month, it's just not realistic. So those are the challenges that we're facing. I will say London councils are looking at, there's an increase in prices for temporary accommodation across the board as well, which is driven by inflation. So we're part of the group that's looking to limit that as far as possible, but there are real pressures there.
Thank you very much. There's a few, so I might take a couple this time just to make sure we get through. So let me go to Dan and then Caroline.
Yeah, thank you for those responses. You answered most of my questions, so I'm going to change tack. Given the difficulty in supply, what sort of interest do you think the council might want to have with acquiring its own properties to use for the use of temporary placements, rather than trying to rely on private or the social landlords who are currently struggling to provide accommodation?
Caroline?
Thank you for that, Chair. Yeah, how many temporary properties have you got available at the moment? And also, what are the capacity, i.e. how many people can go into them? And also, how temporary is temporary?
Those questions are somewhat related. The first point is that the council, as you're aware, leases a 81-room hostel called Hall Place, which is in Church Road and in Mitcham. That's our main temporary accommodation that we use. It's mainly for single people or smaller families because it is studio flats in there. We are currently in discussions with another provider looking at a potential property elsewhere in the borough. But the majority of accommodation that we do is on a spot purchase basis. So they're not held by the council, and we're competing with all the other London boroughs when it comes to that, and we're all looking for the same properties. Certainly in looking at whether or not, if the council purchases properties, it can be quite complex around that in terms of whether you can set up tenancies to be temporary or not, or whether or not it's managed by somebody else. And that's the major factor, is obviously the council doesn't have in-house housing management services and repairs, and that's the issue. We would, nothing's off the table in terms of considerations of this, and obviously one advantage would be that it would be local, and that's one of the things. We are looking at many options there.
Did you touch on Caroline's questions there?
Oh, there was one I missed there. Oh no, how temporary was temporary, you did say. That will depend on the size of accommodation required. council gets around 250 properties each year from registered social landlords. I can give you a breakdown from memory for the last year. Last year, there were 35 three-bed properties. There were 68 two-bed properties, something like 137 one-bed properties, and one four-bed property for last year. So you could probably do some of the maths yourself. If you need a smaller property, you're likely to wait less. If you need a larger property, your wait is going to be correspondingly longer. Having said that, I've had 3 4-bed properties in the last 2 months, which is highly unusual, but obviously we're very grateful when that happens.
So obviously in my ward, I'm dealing with some casework and stuff like that. And I've got families that are looking, quite large families that are looking for accommodation. So from what you're saying, really, yes, you can accommodate a lot of people, single people, which is great. But what about the families? There doesn't seem to be the temporary accommodation for them.
Those are the ones that present from point of view of temporary accommodation. I mean, what I just gave there was permanent accommodation, but the same is pretty much true of temporary accommodation. It becomes more and more difficult to find it and to find it locally. So again, Merton doesn't put homeless people a long way away, but depending on the challenges, if you had someone that's got family with special needs or requires disabled properties and things like that, that becomes very challenging on an individual basis, and we have to go out to market to see what we can find. But to be fair, it is harder to place larger families in Merton than it is smaller families.
Andrew.
It is the goal of this administration to start building our own homes, and we have a challenging goal of 400 homes during this administration, and quite likely a portion of those will be temporary accommodation, where it adds up, where it's appropriate accommodation and it's affordable.
Okay, thank you. Anthony and James, and I will do Stephen as well.
Thank you, Chair. A quick question that's not on temporary accommodation. How can we best engage with the SWEP process? And then a quick question on temporary accommodation. One of the criteria for temporary accommodation is connection to the borough. And obviously at the moment, around 2/3 of the people are housed out of borough, including a very small number outside of London. And I know at the moment that is by choice. Are there instances where we house people in temporary accommodation outside of London, outside of their choice? And secondly, on temporary accommodation, we've spoken in the past about the empty homes scheme. Are you still investigating the use of sort of empty homes schemes to increase the number of in-borough temporary accommodation?
Thanks, James. Yeah, I have 2 questions. I wanted to know what are Merton's ongoing responsibilities that they have in place when homeless clients are transferred to other boroughs, and what is the furthest that Merton Council is prepared to house clients? And my other question is, what options does Merton Council have when placing clients outside of Merton? Because all clients have different needs, different ages, different problems. So what options do they have, or is it a one-size-fits-all policy? Sorry, Stephen, I will come to you in a second, but I think that's enough questions for Elliot at this time. So I'll over to you, Ed.
Right, I'll try and wrap together some of the out-of-borough questions there. The council does have a policy that relates to placement of households in temporary accommodation and who gets priority for a local vacancy, who gets priority for a vacancy within 90 minutes travel, and who gets priority for placements outside of that. And some of the factors that would set out in there would be someone that had children doing exams would have priority for a local vacancy. Somebody that's being dealt with by the council's children's services would have priority for a local vacancy. Employment is also a factor. Broadly speaking, we haven't, the 4 cases that are currently placed outside of London, as I said, they're on the outskirts of London as opposed to further afield. Anybody that's placed to the council owns a long-term duty has got a right of review against the suitability of their placement, which could be challenged by the county court. And there's a legal process that's outside of that. If somebody says to us, actually, I have a reason that I want to be somewhere else in the country, we can help them do that on a voluntary basis. So if someone says, you know, I want to move to the East Midlands because I've got family there, we're part of several schemes that can help do that. But generally speaking, you would do that purely on a voluntary basis. But as I said, there is a policy that sets out the factors that prioritises certain households over others. So it isn't one size fits all if that's the case. So the SWEP, for those of you that aren't aware, that's severe weather emergency provisions, which means that during periods of cold weather, which I think is 3 consecutive nights of it being below freezing, there's a cessation of the normal rules on priority need, which means that people to whom the council doesn't normally have a legal duty to accommodate, that's put on hold. So we had that once before Christmas, and we've had it twice in the new year so far. It's mainly aimed at rough sleepers, obviously, because they're the most at risk. And certainly Angela and her team did fantastic work in taking those in. There are always new cases that come up during the SWEP period. I know a neighbouring authority had a massive amount coming to them, so much so they had to set up a rest centre. In Merton, that was managed in a different way. We also have a local winter night shelter as well that we work in partnership with, and there's connections going on there. Certainly for councillors and others, if you come across somebody that says they're rough sleeping during a SWEP period, then they need to be directed to the civic centre, and we will provide them with accommodation. If they've got a Merton connection, we're likely to look to find them longer term accommodation even after the SWEP has ended and keep them in. Did I cover everyone's questions there? In this one.
Well, and if I go Stephen and then Jill.
Thank you, Chair. Hello again. I particularly was interested in the notes you made about Ukrainian provision. I know that we made as a council a plea for more hosts last year. I'm hearing from the drums that there's not very many hosts available now. Can you tell me what the position is there, and if it is not particularly good, if that means it's going to be very difficult for people to find accommodation as homeless people after hosting periods? Thank you.
Okay. Jill I had a question online.
Thank you very much, and my apologies for not being in chamber. This is I've sort of 2 smallish questions, but the first one might be for Andrew and Elliot. In terms of the fact that we've now introduced the Article 4 protocol with regard to HMOs, do you think there is potentially an impact in how many HMOs are going to be created, given that we're getting stricter and tougher? Will that impact us? And then secondly, I have to congratulate you on how we're managing our homelessness figures. Having encountered homelessness myself in Lambeth and not even being offered temporary accommodation, you're doing great. So let's say that in the first instance. What I'm interested in is the actual quality of what we are providing, and in terms of safeguarding as well. For example, do we have the data that indicates us, what is the range of ages that we're getting and the percentage of female versus male? And in terms of safeguarding women, single women in these temporary accommodation environments, are we satisfied that there is a good safeguarding measure in place? Yes, that's it. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I'm just going to, apologies, Elliot, I'm going to sneak in one question from Dan as well.
I also want to say thank you for all the excellent work you're doing in making sure Merton's a leader in terms of the number of residents in temporary accommodation. I wanted to follow up on Caroline's one and ask if you could perhaps give a figure in terms of the average time a family might spend in temporary accommodation. And also with regards to the duty to provide suitable temporary accommodation, does this often mean that you have overcrowded families in an overcrowded accommodation because of the size, and what do we have?
The Ukraine issue, first of all. Colleague of mine, Andy Otway-Sill, runs the Homes for Ukraine scheme. We do try and rematch people to other hosts, but it is becoming more difficult. And as time moves on, people who've been part of the hosting process are expecting people to move on, frankly. So the first point is usually to try and rematch if we can. But failing that, then the statutory homelessness system's there. We have got funding specifically for people from Ukraine. However, the same issues I raised earlier in terms of private sector affordability and supply remain an issue. The demographics of the group mean that quite a lot of them are working, which is helpful for when negotiating with landlords. And I've done a number of talks with some Ukrainian groups at churches. You know, I've heard about agents and landlords asking for several years worth of references. Well, most of these people have not been in the UK anywhere near long enough to get that, and it's sort of given as a sort of fait accompli, well, therefore we can't help you, or asking for guarantors. So there's no doubt it is challenging. I mean, those sort of factors do affect the homeless population as a whole, but it you know, all of those factors are making it challenging for people from Ukraine. So what we are trying to do is help as many as we can, or point them in the right direction before their homelessness becomes acute and they have to leave, but it's difficult. Moving on to the suitability of temporary accommodation, there is an inspection process, certainly for studios and one-bed flats from London, or for London Council's called Setting the Standard, which involves an inspection of temporary accommodation. We do also carry out some of our own inspections. Obviously, there are problems that arise with temporary accommodation and quality, and we seek to deal with them as quickly as we can. And you know, if there are issues with temporary accommodation, we seek to move people. In relation to safeguarding, you know, obviously there are some cases are different. If you've got people that are fleeing domestic abuse, we generally use women's refuges and other support agencies that can support those cases, and have got on-site bespoke support. I mentioned a bit about supported housing provision in the borough at the YMCA, but also at some other providers. We use a place called Merton Action for the single homeless. We also have a lot of our 16 and 17-year-olds, and there's someone there 24/7 providing on-site support. So, and obviously if there are particular cases that may have mental health issues, and we work in partnership with other agencies to see if we can provide wraparound support to make sure that they are supported in temporary accommodation, it's the right type of accommodation. If it isn't, then we need to work with partners to find the right type of accommodation for individuals. In terms of overcrowding in temporary accommodation, certainly the legal position regarding what's suitable will look at how long someone's likely to be there, and there's a slightly, it will be looked or treated in a slightly different way than very long time of permanent accommodation. So it is fair to say that people in temporary accommodation may be overcrowded. However, they would be given priority on the council's waiting list to reflect the fact that if they're deficient of 1 bedroom or 2, or there were medical factors, that of course, wherever possible, we seek to provide something that meets all of their needs. In terms of average waiting time, it's difficult. You know, the council operates a choice-based lettings scheme, which means that people can exercise the choice of whether or not to bid on a particular property. So if somebody's waiting for a house and not a flat, and I can perfectly understand why they might do so if they've got children, well, the reality is most social housing stock is flats as opposed to houses, not exclusively so, but people will wait longer as a consequence of that. So we don't have specific average waiting times, but depending on how flexible somebody is, they may wait less than they would if they're waiting for a certain area or a certain property type. Does that answer your question?
Andrew?
Yeah.
in terms of the Article 4 direction, it's not intended that that would lead to a reduction in the number of HMOs, but we do hope it will lead to a significant improvement in the quality of HMOs, because the requirements of obtaining planning permission should mean that room sizes are appropriate, that recreation spaces are appropriate, that communal spaces are, that presentation and facilities for waste bins are appropriate, that you've got suitable noise insulation in homes with a lot of occupants. So we don't know whether it will lead to a reduction, but we certainly believe that overall we need an improvement in quality.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, we'll do one honour the last question, and then we'll be moving on in the interest of time. So over to you, Victoria.
Thank you, Chair. On temporary accommodation, we obviously place people in other boroughs. Do we have a sense of how many other boroughs are placing people here in temporary accommodation? And is that sort of monitored regularly? And then one extra one, just on the kind of longer term rough sleepers. In my ward, we have a few. We're obviously in regular contact with you in the wide offices. I'm always kind of questioning how efficient that is from our side, and I just wondered if you have any thoughts on how we can sort of better improve how we engage with you, just so that we, because we get regular questions from residents about how they're doing. Their perception might be that the council isn't doing anything, and clearly we know they are. So it's sort of how do we best engage with you to just keep up to date on what their status is? I'm just be interested to hear. Thank you.
Okay, well, certainly with regard to rough sleepers, it is all about communication. And as you say, the perception is sometimes the council isn't doing anything, and actually behind the scenes work is going on. For instance, last year, there was somebody sleeping in Malden Station. We were offering that person accommodation pretty much every day, and they were refusing it. However, they were very visible. And obviously the perception would have been, well, the council's doing nothing here. So, you know, we're always happy to speak to you and give you a summary of where we're at with the particular individuals. Some rough sleepers have got very challenging behaviours, which means that they may not even engage with the service. We sometimes go through other, you know, the charity sector, where they may trust more than that. So, you know, really it's just a case of, if you've got anyone that you think is rough sleeping, you need to report it to us. They may well be known to us. We might be able to give you a lot of information back on that. So what was the other point again?
Temporary accommodation in and other boroughs.
Oh, that
having used temporary accommodation here.
Apologies. There is a legal process. If you place in another borough under section 208 of the Housing Act, you have to send a notification to that local authority. Across London, that's mainly done through something called the IBAA reporting, and there is an annual report that looks at whether boroughs are net exporters or net importers of temporary accommodation. I can tell you that Merton gets quite a lot of placements from Lambeth and Wandsworth. Croydon, on the other side of things, get a lot of placements from other local authorities. So that is looked at. I don't think Merton has masses of other local authorities placing in there, but there are some.
Great, thanks so much. I just want to say something quickly. I want to pick up on something that Martin mentioned earlier about obviously kind of the concerning rise in people in the temporary accommodation in Merton we've seen over the last year. I was wondering, as far as I can tell, I don't think that information is currently in our performance monitoring information that we receive before our meeting. So I think it'd be really useful for that to be included going forward, so that we can monitor that over time and see if that's something we need to maybe bring back to the panel in the future. So would it be possible to, going forward, to include that information in the performance monitoring that we receive?
Yeah, we certainly numbers in temporary accommodation is pretty much our number one performance management indicator. We could include prevention performance as well on that, so you can see the two factors together.
That'd be much appreciated, Anthony.
May I make a recommendation or two, Chair, on this paper? Thank you. So the first recommendation, I think this was a question you missed, although at the time you both nodded your assent to it, that the empty home scheme would look to provide more temporary accommodation. I want to propose that we recommend to support Cabinet's attempts to increase the amount of temporary accommodation in the borough, for example, through the empty home scheme. So that's one recommendation. The second recommendation I wondered if we might recommend is that we recommend that Cabinet has a scheme that doesn't house people over 90 minutes in temporary accommodation over 90 minutes away, except by choice, where the individual chooses it. I think that's the policy anyway, but I think it might be helpful or reassuring.
So I think with both of those, I mean, I'd like to bring in the thoughts of Andrew and Elliot on those. I mean, my feelings would be, I think that both of those sounds like things that are going on at the moment. So, but I'd like to bring, Elliot and get your thoughts on those, maybe Andrew's as well.
Yeah, firstly, apologies for missing the point on empty homes. Just to say that obviously the council's going forward with an empty home scheme, which should be operational in July. That's looking at appointing an officer and also having a grant scheme to try and bring empty homes back into the use. If you go through that grant scheme, the property will be offered back to the council as part of its ways of dealing with homeless cases. That could be as a prevention or relief thing, but also to relieve temporary accommodation. So, and there'll be targets associated with the bringing homes back in on that basis. In terms of the policy, there is an existing policy that has this three stage version with a priority for in borough, priority within 90 minutes, and then outside, and those cases that could be placed outside of that. We're not, if ever possible, placing people outside of that if we can. I suppose my only one comment will be around what demand looks like in the future and what the market factors in London are, because that's going to really determine where we can put people. In an ideal world, put everybody in the borough, and I wouldn't make anybody go outside the borough, but it's about availability. So that's the only comment there.
Andrew, any reflections?
Well, I think Councillor Fairclough mentioned the empty home scheme. It has enormous potential. We calculate there are at least 1,900 homes in the borough for which there's no rational reason why they are empty. But it is about encouraging the owners actually to bring them up to rentable condition and to rent them to the borough. So it requires a lot of footwork, really, and a lot of labour by the council officers within that scheme. But we are hoping to introduce it, as I said, I think in July. So it has potential. We'll have to see how much that potential actually results in really positive offers of accommodation.
Okay. So I think my thoughts on the empty homes one is, I think this is continuing work that's already going on. So if the recommendation is continue the work that's pre-existing,
I think the recommendation is to support it, is to put on record this panel's desire to support the work that is ongoing. I think there is a mood that increasing temporary accommodation in the borough is a good thing, and I think it's important that we set that as policy direction and feedback into the cabinet's processes.
Mm-hmm. So how would you word what you?
I think it's that this panel recommends to support the cabinet's moves to increase the amount of temporary accommodation in borough through schemes such as the empty home scheme, which is coming forward, or something like that. Mm-hmm. If that's acceptable.
Stella, did you hear that? So just in terms of is that useful? Is that kind of chimes with what Elliot?
I think recommendations from this panel are always useful.
Yeah. Okay. Brilliant. Well, I'd be happy to support that. So maybe take a vote on that. So all those in favour? All those against and not voting? Brilliant. Passed. And on the 90 minutes, I think I'd kind of be minded to agree with what Elliot was saying about the demand issues and not kind of tying ourselves to anything where, like as we are kind of seeing this quite worrying increase, that, we don't know what measures might have to be considered in the future. Anthony.
I was going to say, recommendations of this panel don't bind. The cabinet is free to act as it chooses. They are simply recommendations. So we're not stopping the cabinet putting anybody outside of that 90-minute kind of accommodation kind of area. But I think I certainly feel it's important, given that to even get on the temporary accommodation list, you have to have that local connection, that we should say, as a matter of intention or good, what we would like the policy to be, that I would like to propose that we recommend that cabinet don't house people in sort of temporary accommodation outside of that 90 minutes unless by choice. obviously that doesn't bind Cabinet to do that. If Cabinet need to do that, they can. But I would hope that we would all share the view that given these people have to have a local connection, we should do it as locally as possible.
I think I'd agree with that, but I think the issue for me is I think we try and do that the utmost. I think that's something that we're already but Dan, I'm happy to hear any other thoughts on.
Yeah, I just want to query that. Would that be 90 minutes by public transport or by car? Because that can really affect the distance one can get in 90 minutes. So should we tighten that definition up? Otherwise, 90 minutes, you can get a long way.
It's generally by travel by public transport or car. That's one of the two. That's what it says in the policy. Generally public transport, I would say.
Okay, so I think my thoughts may not change. I think that we're already doing work along these lines, and I think that binding us to that already. I think we're already working on that. So I'd be minded to not support that, but I'm happy. Do you want to say something?
Only that, I reiterate again, we set recommendations to Cabinet. We do not bind Cabinet. In fact, even full council can't bind Cabinet except on the budget. So the Cabinet can do, we're not tying the Cabinet's hands ever, but I think it is important that we say, there have been very recent cases or relatively recent cases where someone was housed outside that 90-minute thing, not by choice. I appreciate at the moment, and we have a policy that isn't the case, but I do feel it's important that we say, put our flag in the sand. We think that, people should be within the 90 minutes, not outside it. And obviously I would like us to vote on that. If we vote it down, we vote it down, but I'd like to propose it.
Okay, thank you. Pun? Oh, sorry.
Just perhaps to clarify, as I said earlier on, we have a legal responsibility to place people in the borough if we can. So that policy isn't about deciding that we are going to put people out of the borough, but rather in situations where we don't have any choice, there are factors that we look at that give some cases priority over others. So the starting point with any case that approaches the council as homeless is you try to place them in Merton.
Yeah, I think I'd agree. I think as we have a legal duty, and I think we're doing the best we can. I don't think I'd be fine support, but I have to take a vote on it. So all those in favour?
Can I just ask if the proposal is subject to a maximum of 90 minutes without statement as to how that 90 minutes is achieved? It's actually, as has been mentioned, an enormous area, in which case, if we can clarify that that's not actually stated, I'd be grateful, because it does affect my vote. One, we're talking about 40 miles, and the other is probably about 150 miles. So I'm quite willing to go for a 150-mile limit, but I'd quite like to know what we're talking about.
Sure. Do you want to clarify, Anthony?
Well, the council has a policy around 90 minutes. I think it's for the council to determine what that is. I think it might be statutory. I'm not sure, but Elliot can advise on that.
It's not statutory, but that formulation is very, very common in London. Some London boroughs have policies that will be further afield than that as well. But it is fairly common to have a in borough 90 minutes, because 90 minutes pretty much covers London, Greater London, in terms of where someone can be.
Just comment on this from Dan.
Chair, can you just provide some clarity? Are we really talking about the recommendation asking the council to not act illegally? Are we going to be voting on the recommendation asking the council to not do something illegal? Because if that is basically what we are doing, aren't we demeaning ourselves as a scrutiny panel by asking the council, please do not act illegally? I don't see the sense of voting on this.
Well, I think then I take your vote that you'd be voting against. So going over last point of this, because I do want to move on, because we do have a lot to give.
Okay, we're not asking the council to not act illegally. The council certainly does have some duties to house in Merton if it can, but in certain instances it doesn't. I think what we're setting down is, and this feeds into the whole policy picture of trying to make sure we have enough temporary accommodation locally. That's the point of this. So what we're saying is that this panel feels that it should not be the case that we would ever house people outside that 90 minutes except by choice. And that's the position. We're not asking them to follow the law, as you say. That would be pointless. Why would we do that? So we're neither binding them to not let people if they need to do it, and we're neither just asking them to follow the law. We're saying as a matter of policy, we don't think, you know, we actually, the point of it is we think there should be enough accommodation locally that we wouldn't need to do that. No, that's the point, is that's what it's feeding into. So it's part of that. That's essentially
okay, but actually, so before we just recommence that vote, I need to take a seconder as well. So is anyone to second that? Victoria, great, thank you. So all those in favour? And against? And I think, well, Jill isn't joining us. She can't vote, but it's a tie vote. So casting votes, so I'll vote that down. Yeah, that's what I believe. Yeah. Yeah, 5 against. That was my vote, and then I believe I get a, as the rules, I get a casting vote. So when in the settling a tie, I believe. I mean, you've also, I'm sure, you've been in this as well.
Yeah. Sadly, I'm forced to agree with that.
Yeah.
Having used it in the past to
Yeah.
carry votes, it would be churlish to say.
Can I make a recommendation?
Sure, go for mine.
I'd like to propose that as a council, we do obviously everything possible to house people in Merton as a top priority, and obviously as close as possible to the borough, given obviously the needs of those people, and to procure accommodation, to look at options to increase the procurement of accommodation through empty homes and capital letters. Obviously, we've had the constraints, but I think it is important that it's on record that we obviously want people to be housed, if possible, in the borough.
Anthony, so I want to keep this discussion very brief because we do have a lot to get through.
Being facetious, would that not simply be a statement of the law as it is?
I think it's just that should be obviously, I think, reiterated by us as a scrutiny panel. Obviously, that the first preference should be that people are housed in Merton and as near to the borough as possible. And
yeah, I think we've already been told by officers that's a function that's a matter of course already. So we're asking them to do something as a matter of
I just think it's obviously important to reiterate that as a panel. Really, I think it is important that, and obviously, you know, options to increase the provision of accommodation, obviously through capital letters, and providing additional temporary accommodation, and bringing empty homes into use. And I think we should have that.
Okay, I'm very keen not to have a too long a discussion. Did you get that recommendation? Is there a seconder for that recommendation? Oh, James? Okay, fantastic. Well, let's go to vote then. So all those in favour? All of those against and not voting? Great, that passes. Okay, so with that, thank you very much, Elliot, for that. Very much appreciate that and all your answers there. So I'll now move on to discussion of air quality. So thank you very much to the officers joining. And if I could just say, as we are running a bit short, if you keep your remarks, I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions. So anything you don't get to cover, I'm sure will come up in the questions. So if you could be as brief as you can. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I think I should introduce myself first of all. My name is Jason Andrews. I manage air quality and contaminated land for the Regulatory Services Partnership that serves 3 London boroughs, including Merton, Wandsworth and Richmond. It's hosted by Merton. I'm joined today by colleagues Davide Pasquarella and our new Head of Service, James Armitage. I was asked by Scrutiny to put together a paper around monitoring of air quality in the borough. It's a very complex area of science, and I've tried to try and make it as brief as possible. I think my microphone's cutting out on me. If you can indulge me for a few minutes, what I'd like to do is just talk to the paper very quickly. And it might make things a little bit clearer. So first of all, we know air quality is a particular issue in the borough and across London. It's now considered the most significant risk to human health, the most significant environmental risk to human health.
We as a borough, like every other London borough, have a legal duty. We've declared the borough an air quality management area for two types of pollution. One is nitrogen dioxide and the other is particulates. We have a very, very extensive monitoring network. We have 50 diffusion tubes plus 2 automated monitoring stations. In addition to that, we have a number of projects around citizen science and special projects such as Weir Road and various other individual projects around that. In 2021-22, we secured some external funding to introduce or play a role in the new Breathe London project hosted by Imperial at London. And we were a little bit greedy on that, and we managed to secure 68 monitors in the borough. We also linked them with movement sensors, traffic movement sensors, so we can get a really good picture in the borough. What I will say at this point is that we're still collating the evidence, the data for 2022. It's reported annually, and that's a calendar year, so we won't be reporting on 2022 until probably the summer. So the information you have in front of you is from the annual status report from 2021. But the good thing is that we do have this gold mine of information around air quality, probably not seen in many London boroughs, and it's going to take some time to dig through that, and hopefully that'll influence our new air quality action plan. So I think I'll stop at that point because there's probably going to be lots of questions on this. So I'll stop here.
Well, just a question, just to say, I remember having a meeting with you a few months ago where we spoke through some of the stuff you're doing. I was incredibly impressed with the work that you and your team were doing. But I'll open the floor for questions. So and take a few at a time. So go Anthony, Dan, other Dan.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Jason, for the paper. It's a really interesting read, and you're obviously doing lots of great work. I know we've exchanged emails on this briefly, but I think my understanding is that there are some new legal requirements in relation to the monitoring of fine particulates coming in, and I wondered if you might talk about how the current monitoring arrangements, how are they adequate to deal with that additional monitoring that's coming in, or would additional investment be helpful?
As an air quality specialist, I'd always welcome investment. We did preempt this work, and we, as I say, we sort of invested heavily in the Breathe London monitoring, which is around PM 2.5s. And the great thing about that is that we have the backing of one of the leading universities when it comes to dealing with the data. So we're on the front foot on that one. Our automated stations don't currently have PM 2.5s, but we'll be making the necessary capital bids on that. In addition, we are going to release some funding assigned to Plough Lane to build a new monitoring station, and that will cover PM 2.5. So I think the answer is, I think we're there.
Thank you, Jason, for that report. The air quality action plan that we worked on a number of years ago, one of the key things out of that was works on building sites to reduce emissions, which has been quite a good success of the council. The other one was the anti-idling policy and getting up all those signs. But my only criticism would be there hasn't been as much follow-up enforcement. I was wondering if that's something that your department plans to do in the next year, because that's something that, particularly on school streets, people do mention quite a bit.
Thank you, Councillor. Fully aware of that.
Sorry, sorry, Dan first, quickly, sorry.
I'm going to add to your burden of questions, sorry. So I wanted to ask about, so I noted in the report, in 3.8, we talk about how the main source of pollution in town centres remain road traffic. And so that's really important that bold measures are taken to remove the dirtiest vehicles and reduce vehicle numbers in the town. So can you tell me any kind of policies that might be coming on the horizon that might be doing that, and how many lives you expect might be saved by that? And also, in terms of the public health impact of poor air quality, do you know, do we have data about how many deaths how many coroner certificates cite air pollution as a contributing cause to death in Merton?
So I'll answer the first question, anti-idling one, which is an easy one. I met with the new head of parking services. They are ready to go. They have the equipment to look at interventions as part of their day-to-day business. We have about 1 or 2 events that we host ourselves a month as part of the pollution team, and we welcome councillors to come along to those. So there's lots going on that, but we do know that there's CEOs, and we're trying to push that aspect to it. On the second question, there's some really complex ones there. Sometimes lots of traffic we don't have much control over, and I think as a borough we need to start pushing the sustainable travel and having the infrastructure around that. We have things like the should I mention it, the ULEZ zone that's coming in that is going to be driving for cleaner vehicles. And in terms of deaths, there was a public health report that attributed a certain amount of deaths per borough, and I can share that with you. In terms of coroner certificate, there was a recent case with Elia Dukis Deborah that cited air pollution, which obviously ramped up how important that is. But there's a lot of complex questions there because it is about moving away from vehicles and how we can push that change, and that's a tricky one.
Great, thank you. Take some more questions if there are. Caroline, James, any others? Great. Come to you, John, after. Yeah.
Oh, yes, thank you, Chair. Yes, I actually do change the diffusion tubes outside the schools in my ward, so, which is good. But what I wanted to ask was about the red routes, because obviously the ward I'm in, which is Ravensbury ward, we've got St Helier Avenue, Bishopswood Road, Morden Road, and as you probably know, they're full of absolutely massive, great lorries and skips and all sorts of vehicles like that. So would you have any plans to kind of cut those down because they're probably causing a hell of a lot of pollution, and there's so many of them. They're very, very busy roads.
James, sorry, just go to James next.
Yeah, I want to ask, is the council taking any new steps to advertise and encourage the uptake and use of diffusion tubes, especially near schools?
Thanks, James. And then John.
Yeah, the end of the report, you talk about heavy goods vehicles and the London lorry ban and the streets where 7.5 ton vehicles are banned. But it says that there is no enforcement of that because it would be too difficult. Would it be possible to set up some kind of trial scheme in one road where we've had quite a lot of complaints about lorries illegally using those roads to monitor that?
Okay, I'll try and remember that. I do have quite a bad memory, unfortunately. With regards to diffusion tubes, we welcome working with any citizen science group. It raises the awareness of it and helps us understand pollution in the borough. So my colleague here, Davide, is leading on that. And if anybody is interested, then contact us. It's a really important part of engaging with people. In terms of heavy goods vehicles, again, we are limited in what we can do. I can sort of bow to my colleagues in transport on part of this one around that sort of banning on individual vehicles. What we have seen is that the low emission zone in London has driven down the dirtiest vehicles. When I'm talking about dirty, I'm talking about the exhaust and around NOx, not about the weight of the vehicle or the particulates from the tyre wear. We can do certain activities around new construction. We can put limits and have plans around how we can move freight to and from those. But again, it's a difficult one because the roads are open to that traffic. And as a borough, we do try to put pressure on the mayor's office to try and reduce that. But again, it is a difficult one, and it's one we need to look at as part of our air quality action plan. Have I missed a question? I feel like I've missed a question.
I think was there something did you talk to James's question on how to improve uptake for the diffusion tubes?
Yeah, yeah, we work with a number of groups, sustainable merchant groups like that. But again, we're open to people approaching us if they want to do that work. There's other work that we can do around that, and I think part of the new air quality action plan should be around that citizen champion work.
Brilliant, thank you. We'll go one final round of questions. So Victoria, anyone else have anything to say? Recommendation, cool. So go Victoria, Dan.
Thank you, Chair. I just had a question around monitoring around school streets. I know from full council that there's going to be an increase in I think the number of monitors, and we're getting more data through. I'm just quite interested because when I observe the school streets in the mornings, it seems there's quite a lot of displacement to neighbouring roads. So I just wonder how the monitoring sort of process works. Is it that there are monitors on the school street and then the neighbouring roads? Like, how is it you're going to assess the impact from pollution? Thank you.
Dan?
Yeah, thank you. Some of the charts and data shown in your report are from 2019 in terms of car and vehicle types. Do we have any more up-to-date recent figures on that? Because since then we've had big change in car driver types, much more electric. Diesels are dropping through the floor. Do we have up-to-date figures on that?
And just before you answer, I'm going to bring in Jill as well, please.
Thank you, Chair. Couple of questions, really. School streets are incredibly great and successful to a degree. But what I've discovered here in my ward is that it has driven the families parking just a little bit further along out of the area, or they arrive especially early to get into the area and they're idling their engines. What can we do to stop people idling their engines in the school street areas? Because what we've done is basically push the problem along a little bit and still haven't completely tackled it. The other question I have is that I live on an incredibly busy road on Cricket Green, and whilst fossil fuel cars are going to decrease, more electric buses, fundamentally I have juggernauts and vans driving past our windows day in, day out, night in, night out. And I'd like to understand if we've got a strategy to tackle this locally. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Jill. Over to you, Jason.
Okay, thank you for that. In terms of school streets monitoring, we did a whole round of schools. We did some diffusion tube monitoring at schools back in 2018, where we monitored every single school in the borough to give us an idea of which ones that we need to prioritise. And we've now whittled that down to 4. Unfortunately, with the new technology around Breathe London, the real-time monitoring devices, it wasn't really available back in at that time. So all we have is the diffusion tubes, which give hourly as a monthly averages, and doesn't show you those peaks and troughs at certain times. So we're on the back foot with that one. But we do have those monitors in those areas, and they're usually on the border of the school streets to hopefully capture the people that don't necessarily come in but sit there and idle. We do have complaints about certain schools, about idling at certain schools, and where that happens we can do an event around that, perhaps go and talk to the motorist, push some of the CEO work onto that, put up some signs and try and change behaviour. Changing that sort of behaviour is a very difficult thing anyway. We have a behaviour insights project at Lower Barnes Lane with a big flashing sign. And we did some studies around how that influenced behaviour, and it worked really well, but it still didn't resolve the problem. So it's about keep pushing that message. On the information from the LAEI, unfortunately that's the data we have, and that was published last year, and it's always a few years out of date, and it's gathered by the GLA. And it's really relevant at that time, but we know that's constantly changing. We know that the pollution is getting better because vehicles are getting better, and boilers and burners are becoming cleaner. But unfortunately, that's the information we have. We'd like to do something more locally, but that's a very, very expensive thing to do. So we rely on the GLA. There was another question, but I've forgotten. Idling around schools, I think I covered that part. Again, with the strategic plan to deal with large vehicles in the borough is a really complex one, and it's something that we need to work with our transport partners on, about what options we have and what controls that we actually do have in place. But it is a difficult one, because banning those vehicles is a difficult thing, and I think Paul might be able to help on that part.
Paul.
Thank you. I think it's probably this time last year at this panel, we did have a paper on the HGVs, and it is a difficult challenge. There's been movement, as you mentioned, with ULEZ. The council continues to lobby TfL and the mayor about getting cleaner bus fleets into Merton. If you see the air quality map in Merton, the hotspots, Morton specifically, it's probably the bus stations, the main route of it, not the through traffic, but all of it contributes. With the question around lorry bans and HGVs on main roads, generally across London there is a specific network for HGVs to get in and out of London and access industrial estates. So that's where the lorry ban comes from. If it's not an accredited route, it's a lorry ban area. That is enforced by London councils, not the council itself. And that's because the London councils has the legislation that allows them to do that and enforce it. We did look to see whether the council is legally able to, for example, put cameras up and fine HGVs for being in residential streets, but we don't actually legally have that responsibility at the moment. So what we have now with what we call lorry ban streets, it's signage, which is advisory. HGVs or skip lorries can still be in residential streets because if they're accessed or people might be getting building works, you can never tell. Residents will know, you know what's on your street, but the council doesn't have the legislative powers to enforce that at this stage.
Thank you very much. So, Carol, I think we're. I want to make sure we move this on. So, Anthony, you had a recommendation.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I'd like to recommend, if I may, that Cabinet supports the investment in monitoring infrastructure for fine particulates, which was the question I asked about.
Well, I might come back to. So I'm not quite sure. So just or supports the ongoing work that's going on at the moment.
So there is new legislation coming in requiring additional monitoring of fine particulates, the PM 2.5s. We have a network, but there's additional monitoring and additional levels, and I think it would be a good thing to support increased infrastructure in monitoring those. It's the most damaging. They are the most damaging particulates to health, and so I think it would be good. This is what I took from the paper, and I think it would be good to express our support for investment in that infrastructure.
I definitely got an expression of support, though. I did think Jason said you felt that we had that was coming in already. That monitoring system was something that was in the pipeline, and we are working on as we speak. Is that correct?
Yeah, perhaps I can answer that. We had 68 monitors, London monitors in the borough capturing that data. That project came to a close, but the council has invested funding on keeping a portion of those monitors alive. We have about 20. I think that's about right. I don't think we needed to carry on with 68. And that investment obviously will continue. We've got funding for this year. And as I say, we're trying to free funding up for an automated station at Plough Lane as part of the development there.
Great, thank you. So from my understanding, it seems like this is work that's already ongoing. So if it's kind of supporting the ongoing work that we're doing on this, then I can see that. But I don't think it's new. I don't think it's a new recommendation in terms of this is already something that's happening at the moment.
In which case, I'd like to make it a new recommendation that we, there obviously isn't funding quite identified for the new monitoring station at Plough Lane as of yet, although there is work to do there. And also, obviously, there's only a proportion of the monitors being proposed, and I'd like to propose, as Jason said, he'd never turn down investment in monitoring equipment. So I'd just like to propose. I would like to make the proposal, and we can vote against it if we like.
So can you what was the elaborate on
I'd
what
like
you're proposing?
to request that Cabinet support investment in monitoring equipment and monitoring infrastructure for fine particulates in line with the emerging legal obligations to do so.
Yeah, I mean, I think my feeling on this, I mean, and I'm working with the other members, is that this is work that is ongoing, and that we are making these investments, and we are, I hope that we do meet our legal responsibilities when they arise. So as I think something new, I don't think that maybe something that I'd support, but I welcome. Is there any other views in the panel? Otherwise, Caroline?
A quick question. You've spoken a lot about particulates from vehicles, but is there anything else, like from industrial estates or any other places where they are a problem?
Yeah, PM 2.5s, we're seeing wood burning as these modern wood burners that people have in their homes that are contributing, and even where they are legal and they're using authorized fuels, if you get lots of them together, it can cause an impact. We're seeing the increase in commercial cooking around PM 2.5s as well. So it's not just traffic and transport. And I think some of the graphs in here show the causes of that. So there's an opportunity for when we look at the new air quality action plan is to look at the contributions in the borough to those things and have a smart plan aimed around those sources and the ones that we can tackle. But you're absolutely right. It's there's a number of sources for PM 2.5s.
Thanks. Thank you very much. Okay, so to return to the recommendation, is on the recommendation or is it a question?
I was just wondering, Chair, whether we might say something along the lines of that this panel recommends adequate funding be maintained for surveillance of 2.5 particulates, because then if there is sufficient, then there's no change required, and if there's not sufficient, then hopefully there'll be some more.
So again, my feeling would be that there has been funding made available and we are doing things with this. And so I don't think, well, for me, this is a new or this is additional. So I don't think something that I'd be minded to support, but I have one last discussion on this because then we'll go for a quick break to Victoria.
From my understanding, I think it's the new piece with Plough Lane. I understood that's still a bit up in the air, and I guess it's just that overall feeling, which I'm sure we all agree, is that the more the better. Particularly with things like wood burning, all increasing. I think that's maybe the thrust of it, as I took it anyway.
I don't think anyone would disagree that we need as much monitoring systems as we can, but I do think that is work that we have ongoing. So I don't think I'd be minded to support. But is there a seconder for the proposal? And maybe Stella, could you just read out the proposal as you have it? Well, I think they were kind of along the similar sort of lines. Was that? And unless Stephen, you want to take yours to a vote as well. We'll stick with Anthony's for now, and then we can come back to that. So do you?
Councillor supports.
Do you want to put your mic on?
Cabinet supports supports investment for monitoring equipment. Oh, sorry. Cabinet supports. Can't read my own handwriting. Monitoring equipment. I'm going to start again.
First, Anthony, to read out again.
Sure. I was going to suggest, maybe we can borrow some of Stephen's wording, that this panel recommends that Cabinet supports maintaining adequate funding for the investment in infrastructure for the monitoring of fine particulates.
Thank you. And is there a seconder for that proposal? Stephen? Great. Okay, so I'll take that to vote. So all of those in favour? All of those against? I think in this situation before, I will use my casting votes and vote that down. Stephen, are you happy? Would you like to propose yours, or are you happy to move on?
No, I'm happy to move on.
Brilliant. Well, then I'd like to thank very much Jason and your team for all the work that you're doing. It really is massively appreciated, and you do a fantastic job. I think we'll now take a quick break. So it's now 8:52, so we'll come back at 9 o'clock and have our final item. Thanks so much. All right, thank you very much for bearing with us. So now we're going to move on to our final item for today, which is a flooding update. So if I can pass over to the office, is that Tara taking it? Ah, fantastic. All right, well, if I could pass over to Natasha.
Hi, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Hello, thanks, Chair. Thank you to the Chair and thank you to officers for this report. This is about flooding issues in the borough, and I think the primary driver was just to give everybody an update following the significant and horrendous flooding that we suffered in summer 2021. And just before we go on, it's important to always say when we talk about flooding that if you do experience flooding, please report it to Thames Water, not just the council, because members will remember that when we had images of cars floating down the road in Rains Park on Sky News, Thames Water claimed they hadn't received any reports from residents, so that meant they didn't know that there was an issue. So it's really important to make sure that we continue to report things to Thames Water. So following those flooding events in 2021, Thames Water have undertaken an independent expert group review and investigation into what happened. They've been looking at they made a range of recommendations around things like governance, funding, evidence, communication, and strategic planning. But despite our officers participating in the review and attending lots of workshops and really engaging with the process, Merton didn't have any specific recommendations along with other outer London boroughs. So the review tended to focus mainly on central London. It was quite disappointing for us people out in outer London. So I wrote to Thames Water asking for them to agree to give us progress reports on the recommendations, to share data about their planned work, so we can get in and join in with that work to inspect gullies and sewers, and to understand what their investment plans were for Merton. But we have yet to receive a formal response, despite us meeting with them a few times now. So as outlined from 3.11 to 321, the council has been doing a range of measures. There's quite a lot in there. I'm not going to read them all out to you. I'm sure you've all had a chance to read the report, but some of the key things is just that there's been a lot of deep cleaning of gullies and pipe work in high risk areas, so desilting and taking out a lot of the stuff in the sewers there. Undertaking a lot of CCTV surveys of the drain network, ensuring that there's no blockages or breakages within the sewers. We've got 3G sensors in our some of our gullies in high risk areas, so particularly around Rains Park, so that if there's any blockages, we can get in and remove them. The council's been working with to create a flood alleviation project with Thames Water, the Environment Agency, and Network Rail to create long-term plans for areas like Rains Park. And we've also invested in sustainable drainage systems or rain gardens for a number of areas, and I think there's a project happening as we speak in Rains Park that's just kind of kicked off very recently. And we've also hosted the Environment Agency and the Thames Regional Flood and Coastal Committee and Thames Water. We hosted them in the borough a few weeks ago. We took them on a bit of a tour of the lake safety project over in Wimbledon Park, and to show them also the deculverting project that opens up the brook in Wimbledon Park, and that work's been nominated for a medal. So that's really amazing. We'll let you know how we get on with that. There's been a lot of work going on with the council since the flooding events that happened in the summer, but I think it's really time to just kind of answer any questions that you have, and officers are on hand to answer anything technical. Yeah, looking forward to hearing your questions.
Great, thank you very much. Are there any officers who want to elaborate any more, or should we jump straight into questions? I'll take that as a jump. Questions. Victoria, any other questions? And if not, over to you.
There's been a persistent problem at the bottom of Durham Road, just above Rains Park High Street. We've been in touch, I think, with officers and Thames. I just wondered if you'd had any updates from Thames Water. The last we had from them was sort of 10 days ago, saying they'd investigate. They did dig up the road a few months ago, but nothing's happened. So obviously it's leads right down into that area where it's prone to flooding. So it'd just be good to understand what's happening there. And secondly, I was just interested to understand, I know John's not here, but just in terms of the leaf clearing, I noticed that all the feeder roads down to Rains Park High Street, I don't think they're on the list as being priority for leaf cleaning because they don't flood themselves. But obviously there's a lot of silt that's been cleared out of Rains Park High Street. And I noticed on Durham Road particularly, there was a big leaf dump, and then they were just kind of left, and they, you know, presumably broke down and then got into the drainage system. That just seems a bit counterintuitive to me if we've then spent money removing all that silt. So just wondered if there's kind of links, if there's a link up between those sort of two different departments, and what we could, you know, just think about that for the future, essentially. Thank you.
I think that's so. On the last point, I think the thing to say is that we need, if you've seen that they haven't been cleared in timely, in a good fashion, please flag that up with the public spaces team, because they need to get in and clear the leaves. But there is a kind of leafing program, as you know, and you would have received the email saying that we're cleaning this part of the borough at this point, but please flag if it's taking a bit too long. As I said, we've got the gully sensors in high risk areas, including in and around Rains Park. So if there is blockages, we should be alerted to it. And I think you would have noticed last summer, when we had a lot of rainfall, and actually we didn't experience the flooding like we had in 2021. And I think that's because that's a lot of the proactive work that Thames Water and the council have been doing to try and make sure that things keep clear and flowing. On working with Thames Water and digging up the roads, the council's been trying to help them to facilitate all of this proactive work of trying to make sure that the sewer network is fit for purpose, and they've installed a new pump underneath Rains Park Bridge. So that might have been what you had seen. In terms of longer term projects, so as it says in the report, the council's trying to work with Thames Water, the Environment Agency and Network Rail to have a much longer term project. They have funding, everything's ready to go. They're just waiting for some legal sign-offs, and I think officers will probably jump in and probably able to give you more detail about the delays that have caused what has caused those delays.
Any officers want to jump in there?
Yes, thank you, Councillor. Just to pick up the point directly about Durham Road, it has been an ongoing issue for quite some time, and we have brought Thames Water in on it. The actual issue there at Durham Road is a clean water leak. It's not anything to do with their sewerage system, but they have set up on site this week. I understand that they've put that forward as a emergency works, even though it has been going on for some time. They've put a street works permit in under emergency works to get that repair undertaken, and that is being dealt with through our street works team. With regards to the leafal question that was raised, we do share our works programs. So while myself and Salisa is also on the line here, we share all our gully cleaning work with Veolia, who are contracted to do the cyclical cleansing from a gully point of view. So we do let them know, and if there are parking suspensions, we do obviously inform them as well, so they can get in there and sweep the roads at the same time. Salisa, if you want to come in on anything.
No, I think you covered. Can you hear me? Sorry.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, okay, thanks. Yeah, no, I think those 2 points have been covered well.
Great. Thank you very much. And we'll sort of take a few questions. So take Anthony, Dan, and other Dan.
Thank you, Chair. One of the things that Thames Water used to come back with, certainly in 2020 and 2021, was that their statutory requirement was to have an infrastructure system that dealt with events up to once in 30-year events. But the rainfall that we were facing, despite the fact that it was once or twice a year for the last 5 years, were in fact once in 100 or once in 300-year events, and therefore there was nothing they could do about it. Is that still their position and their approach? In which case, is there something we need to get changed at a regulatory level to change Thames Water's approach?
I think I'll let. Oh, sorry, go on.
Sorry, Natasha. I'm just going to go to Dan next.
Yes, following on from that, Thames Water are very bad at communications. So is there a way that we could, when we do any schemes jointly with Thames Water, could we find a way to get them to actually let residents know and inform us of such works rather than finding out afterwards whether they've done something or not? Because it did annoy lots of people on Warple Road in particular, and I try my best to let as many people know when the works happened, but Thames were inept and refused to actually tell anybody.
Thank you. And Dan?
I was a little bit in disbelief when I read on page 61 that Thames, if you have sewage in your house, you have to print off a PDF form and then pop it in the post box, which it's staggering. This is a urgent threat to public health. I know that officers have been working hard to encourage Thames Water to get with the 21st century and make sure that this doesn't happen. Is there an update in this? And what is their logic? Why did they say that you have to pop to the post box to report an urgent threat to public health?
Over to you, Natasha.
I think to take the last point first, that has changed, I believe, and that's changed because of a lot of the lobbying that the officers on this call have made. For the exact point in that it makes absolutely no sense to ask someone to print something off when their house is covered in sewage and they need some help. So that's now an e-form on their website, and that really can be linked to the work of the officers in this council lobbying hard for that. In terms of the 1 in 100 events, I think I'll let the officers kind of come back on the specifics and the kind of how that works in practice. But from how I've found this experience of, this is my first time really dealing with anything to do with flooding and with Thames Water in particular, it feels to me as if there needs to be an update in terms of how we see these things, given climate change is making these things more and more regular, and there needs to be a bit more of a kind of proactive approach to how they treat the seriousness of flooding events. I think they are, I mean, officers can correct me, but they seem a bit more willing to talk to Merton and talk to us and engage with us and are trying to work to improve things, particularly in areas like Rains Park. But I think there needs to be a bit more of a structural change in how they approach these one-off events that seem to happen very regularly. And in terms of get them to be better at communicating their programmed works, I'm sure that there must be a way to do it, but their emergency works, I'm not sure how we would get around that. But again, I can let officers kind of give some detail on that.
Great, thank you. So I know Jill is waiting online. Are there any other questions in the room? And if not, oh, Dan? Great, so we'll go to Jill and then to Dan.
Hello, thank you, Chair. Yes, couple of things. Cricket Green Ward, I have a particular hotspot nightmare issue, which is consistently being flooding, as it were, my inbox. It's the junction of Bramcote Avenue and Cricket Green. Now, the officers went down to clear the gullies. And when you inspect more closely, you realize that at some point, some works have been done on this whole stretch of Cricket Green that starts at the Cranmer Green and all the way down to London Road. When that road was resurfaced, they raised the level of the road surface so that it almost cut the escape gullies in half. So when they're blocked with leaves, no hope in hell. But when the leaves were cleared, which they were very quickly, it's transparent. There is an insufficient escapage. And the problem at Bramcote Avenue is that it's right by a bus stop. So if anyone was waiting for a bus, they're literally by a lake. The problem seems to filter all around the back streets of Cricket Green, Mitcham Park Road. So I'm wondering if I'd be happy to attend a site meeting to show the problem. So that's my first thing. The second thing is I at the risk of sounding really mean and horrible, I wonder whether we've been able to take Thames Water to task on their gross mishandling of the flooding that occurred on Lower Green West towards the end of last year, where they didn't direct traffic properly and people were driving and destroying parts of our greens, which we've ended up having to take care of. And, you know, can we hold them account into the way they operate these things? Because it was an absolute disaster zone. Thank you.
Thanks, Jill. And then over to Dan.
Thank you. One of the parts of the report mentioned that Thames Water have two different types of sewer network, a rainwater one and a foul water one. And when it rains, one gets into the other and backs into people's homes. Has Thames Water actually ever got round to resolving that? Because the last I heard, they hadn't, and I've not heard from them for a while.
Thanks, Dan. Are there any final questions? Okay, and let's Caroline ask you a question, and that'll be the end of the questions.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Yes, I was just really thinking that when there are new builds, and I mean there's an awful lot of flats going up and other office buildings and all that. So how stringent are the flood risk assessments for that? And also I'm thinking as well about the new estate in Ravensbury Grove as well, because that's built on a floodplain.
Great, thank you. Over to you, Natasha.
I think there might actually be one specifically for officers, given that so they've got basically two things from Jill there around the infrastructure, the physically there, and if officers can kind of have a look and see if there's a solution. In terms of the flood risk assessments, I think I would again think we need some assurances from officers that they are kind of stringently putting planning applications through that process. And there was a third question, wasn't there? Is it Dan? Was there one from Dan? Sorry.
Yeah, do you want to repeat your question, Dan?
Yes, it's regarding Thames Water in certain parts of Rains Park and Hillside. They have two different types of sewers.
Yeah,
one's
okay.
for rainwater, one's not, and one keeps getting into the other and backing into people's homes. Have they fixed that yet?
Okay, I'll pass over to Salisa, who will know the detail on that more than I do.
Hi, thanks. I will take, I think it was Caroline's question about the new bills, and Councillor Irons touched on it, in that, yes, the flood risk assessment, both Tom and myself, we look at the flood risk assessments that come through, and I think we have always been a bit ahead of the curve in Merton, in that we have stricter policies on sustainable drainage for all development that come through the borough. So those are things that we definitely maintain and are quite strict on, because when you look around the borough, one of the greatest risk is surface water flooding. So I'd like to, assure you that is definitely being done. Regarding, I'm going back, there was a question, I think it was from Councillor Fairclough on the return periods and Thames Water. I think legally, Thames Water have to, their system, yes, is designed to what is called a 1 in 30 flood. I think it's really important to understand that it doesn't mean a flood will happen once in every 30 years. It's a way, it's a bit of a clunky way of how the extreme events are measured. It's, you know, so it's, yeah, so it's just how it's measured, but that sort of rainfall event can happen in any one time. When we look at the hydraulic data for the flooding that occurred in 2021, there was some really, really intense rainfalls. And when we looked at the hydrology in a lot of parts of the southwest of the borough, you had events that would be classed at least probably about 1 in 60. So that sort of water will almost always overwhelm the system. And coming back to what we can do for Thames Water, that has to be a legislative change. But keep in mind that with that legislative change, we'll need to come with funding for it. So it's a much bigger issue than any one local authority can deal with. But it doesn't mean it's not a message that should be sent. So that's on that one. Regarding, Jill, I think you mentioned some issue on Cricket Green Ward on Bramcote Avenue. Tom and I are aware of this, and we are looking to see what can be done here. We have already met with Thames Water on this, because what we have, when we looked at Thames Water's network and ours, we realized that there's a larger problem in the entire area. So it will need a lot more work done to it. So while we were trying to see what can be a quick fix, there isn't a quick fix. So, but we want to assure you that we are working with Thames Water on this. And we have to say Thames Water so far have been pretty good in working with us over the last couple of years to resolve issues. So that is being done. And you're right, there is a larger area. We have driven and seen it in flood and been pretty frustrated ourselves with what's happening there. Regarding the Lower Green West issue, I'm not particularly, I don't remember what happened there. I don't know, Tom, if you were any the wiser, or Jill, if you can tell us a bit more about what.
Yes, certainly. It was towards the end of last year. They were doing some, Thames Water were doing some repair works on the part of Low Green West that goes down from London Road to Church Road, but unfortunately caused a major, whether it was a burst pipe or whatever, that caused a major flood. And when they returned to try and ameliorate it, they had to shut down and divert the traffic. But unfortunately, the barriers and the placement of the diversion was completely useless. And people were then basically cutting across the green areas, and they chomped up the green, and it caused no end of aggravation to me, frankly, and naturally so. It was badly organized by Thames Water.
Okay, I think I will refer to Tara Butler, who may have a bit more information on this.
If I can pass over to Paul.
Paul, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Jill, thank you for describing what happened at Lower Green West. We were aware of that as well. There was a burst pipe. What I understand is that Thames Water did go in to undertake emergency works. However, they didn't seek a permit from the council. So we didn't know what happened until they turned up on site. The reason even emergency works have to go through our team is we can then update sat-nav systems and things so drivers know not to go to that area. That never happened on that occasion, so we are looking to take action against Thames Water. Part of that issue as well was the fact that when drivers saw the barriers which were insufficient, drivers just drove around it and drove across the green. that's not decent behaviour either. But yeah, we are looking to take action against Thames Water for that.
Thank you. And I think Dan, did you get an answer to your question? No. So
I'll come in on that
to
one.
speak to Dan's question.
I'm happy to answer that one. So I think, Councillor Holden, you're referring to Warple Road, particularly where we've had consistent issues with Thames Water backing up into a number of the flats and basements there. So the problem ultimately is the fact that there is an overflow. So you're correct, in that part of the borough, there's a separate surface water system and a separate foul water system. There is an overflow along Warple Road between the two of them. Thames Water have recently installed a monitoring device on that overflow to see when it kicks in on some of these peak events. So there has been progress on that. And what we've really been lobbying them to do is to install non-return valves, or also known as flip devices, into their system, so there won't be any backing up through toilets or other drains at the low points effectively. So I think the non-return valves, it's still something that they're looking at. They were doing modelling on it because I think they're reluctant to straight away put it in because it may push the problem elsewhere. So they've got to demonstrate and prove that it won't have any impact before they install it. But we're certainly speaking to them about it regularly.
Thanks so much. So no more questions on that, unless Taki, do you have anything you'd like to add on this item? No? Fantastic. Okay, so I'll move to recommendations. I actually have one myself, which is I'd quite like to invite Thames Water to a future meeting to get their, so I'll put these questions to them directly. So is there a seconder that Dan? Great. So I'll just take that straight to a vote. So all those in favour? All those against and not voting? Fantastic. Great. And are there any other recommendations in the room? And if not, I will then move on to the item. So thank you very, very much, Natasha and officers, for your work on that. It's really, really appreciated. And yeah, maybe I'll see you again at a future meeting on this one. Hopefully get Thames Water down to come and talk to us directly. So I'm now just going to move on to the final item, which on the work programme. So I just want to quickly just say on this, Stephen has been doing some great work on looking at public toilet access in Merton. And so I'd like to suggest that we invite him to speak briefly at the next March meeting to update on where he's got with that. I think it'll be a brief update, and then at the June meeting, when there's a bit more time to bring some of the work that he's doing together, we'll then discuss that as well. So I just want to check if that's okay, agreeable to everyone. Agreed? Fantastic. And just the final thing to say is we are now looking for topics for next year. So please do get your suggestions in. I believe you can just email Rosie directly with any suggestions that you have. And so with that, I bring the meeting to a close. Thanks so much all. Much appreciated.